Welcome, my soft-thinking listener. You've found yourself in the company of the sleepy sloth once again. A slow, scientifically minded fellow, who enjoys facts about clay figurines. And things that are, quite quietly, very still. I must tell you something before we begin. Today, I consider myself a scientist in the study of clay figurines. A scientist wannabe who is almost always correct, except for those few times when I am not. But even then, I prefer to drift gently onward, rather than fuss over it. Because what truly matters is the information itself. Before I start, please, let me know. What is the most boring thing you would secretly love hearing about? Let me know gently, in the comments. Now, let us begin today's episode of Clay Figurines. In the 1st century, around 1 CE, in China, humble clay figurines began to depict both humans and animals. These tiny sculptures were made from local clay, often with minute attention to anatomical details that most would overlook, such as the curve of a finger or the bend of a small tail. No one asked for this. And yet, here we are, observing the deliberate and careful molding of each ear, each nose, each little appendage, as if the clay itself were sighing softly under the artist's fingertips. The pigments sometimes used to color these figures were derived from natural minerals, painstakingly ground and mixed, creating muted reds, gentle ochres, and sleepy grays that almost whispered when they caught the soft light. Let us float gently onward to 50 CE, in India, where clay figurines were frequently used in household rituals. These ritualistic objects were placed carefully near hearths or on low shelves, where their presence was barely noticed by most occupants, but profoundly respected by those who arranged them. Each figurine was shaped not merely for appearance, but for function within domestic ceremonies. Fingers would trace the contours during offerings, and the dull, earthy scent of unfired clay mingled quietly with the aromas of cooking grains and lentils. The shaping process itself involved a gentle tapping and smoothing, almost meditative, as the clay was coaxed into the forms of small animals or human figures performing ordinary gestures. This fact is not exciting. Not even a little bit. And that is just perfect. By 100 CE, in Rome, terracotta figurines had reached a remarkable level of mass production, though mass production at the time was nothing like the rushed processes of modern factories. Kilns were used to slowly fire these figurines at carefully controlled temperatures, and each mold was pressed and repressed to maintain consistent shape, yet each piece retained a small individuality, a subtle variation in curve or depth that revealed the hand of the craftsman. Figurines were produced for both domestic enjoyment and religious devotion, often left on shelves or near small altars, where they quietly observe the daily lives of their owners. And so, the repetition of hands pressing clay, shaping it, firing it, and finally arranging it on a small ledge, became a gentle rhythm in Roman domestic life, a rhythm that may never have mattered to anyone outside a quiet household. And yet, mattered just enough to be recorded. Around 150 CE, back in China, clay figurines became integral to burial customs. The figures were placed in tombs to accompany the departed, forming tiny silent assemblies of humans and animals that would not move, would not speak, and would not be disturbed. The soft, earthy tones of the figurines blended with the surrounding soil over time, creating a muted landscape of unremarkable shapes that nevertheless carried profound cultural significance. Artisans paid attention to clothing folds, headgear, and even the postures of the figures, so that each would appear slightly more lifelike than the last, a quiet tribute that only the most patient eye would appreciate. But first, a slow little detour for this extra interesting fact. Some figurines even contained small holes, perhaps for inserting incense or other organic offerings, which, as they slowly disintegrated over centuries, left tiny traces of scent that modern scientists can still detect if they are very careful. By 200 CE, in Greece, clay figurines began to reflect mythological themes more consistently. Figures of satyrs, nymphs, and heroes were crafted with a subdued attention to musculature, gesture, and facial expression. These representations were not intended to surprise or thrill, but to quietly embody familiar stories, passed gently from hand to hand. The smooth clay surfaces often bore faint traces of finger impressions, a tiny reminder that each was held, touched, and perhaps whispered to in soft ritual. One might notice the layering of clay to form drapery folds, the subtle hollowing to balance weight, and the deliberate choice of angles to catch sunlight or lamplight in the faintest, least demanding ways. Let us drift, ever so slowly, to 250 CE, in India, where clay figurines were now distributed widely in urban markets. Merchants arranged them carefully on low wooden shelves, in rows so regular that one could almost predict the spacing without looking. Buyers might handle a figurine briefly before setting it down, noting the gentle weight, the texture of the unglazed surfaces, the faint, comforting smell of fired earth. Figurines depicted humans performing ordinary activities, animals in ordinary poses, and even tiny hybrid forms that were neither fully one thing nor the other, but something quietly in between. The creation of these figurines involved mixing clay to a specific consistency, rolling it into small coils, pressing gently into molds, and smoothing with soft tools, often animal hair brushes, until every curve, every line, every imperceptible indentation whispered its presence to the slow observer. Around the year 300 of our time, in Rome, clay figurines found a gentle place within both decorative and religious contexts, often quietly resting upon small shelves or near the modest altars of homes. These figurines, crafted from soft, earthen terracotta, carried a subtle warmth, the kind that comes from hours spent shaping clay with attentive, tender fingers, pressing, smoothing, and shaping until each curve, however slight, felt right. Some figurines depicted humans in ordinary poses, standing, sitting, perhaps holding a tiny, indistinct object, while others embodied gentle religious symbolism, representing figures whose names most would not recall, yet whose presence was considered quietly necessary. The firing of these clay pieces occurred in kilns that exhaled slow, even heat, transforming moist earth into lasting forms that retained the faint traces of the artisan's touch. One might pause, ever so softly, to notice that each figurine bore slight irregularities, a finger subtly longer than its counterpart, a tilt of the head just barely perceptible, almost like the figurine were leaning into a sigh. In this period, the very act of arranging these figures in a home became ritualized, a gentle acknowledgement of life's small, recurring motions, the soft whisper of devotion or domestic pride. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact. Some figurines were adorned with traces of natural pigment, applied with brushes made from animal hair, resulting in muted ochres and sleepy reds that were never meant to dazzle, only to quietly echo the earthy palette of daily Roman life. Even the smallest figures carried this understated charm, their subtle shapes and muted colors blending into the calm rhythms of the home, as if they existed not for observation, but simply to be quietly present. Let us drift, gently onward, imagining the slow, methodical shaping of each tiny piece, the faint, comforting smell of clay baking in a warm kiln, and the unhurried hands that tenderly held each creation until it rested in its place of soft, ordinary importance. Around the year 350 of our time, in China, clay figurines began to depict soldiers, animals, and servants, capturing, in delicate form, the everyday and ceremonial figures that populated both the visible and imagined landscapes of the era. Artisans prepared the clay carefully, kneading it until it had a pliable softness, then coaxing it into shapes that required patience and repetition, allowing each figure's posture and expression to settle slowly, almost imperceptibly. Soldiers might be portrayed with faintly suggested armor, not meant for scrutiny, but for a quiet indication of role and identity, while animals were rendered in gently arched forms, tails curling with a subtle grace, and servants were shown in mid-task, their gestures preserved forever in unassuming clay. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact. Some figurines were intentionally hollowed, perhaps to reduce the risk of cracking during firing, a technical choice that nonetheless added a whisper of mystery to their tactile presence. Once fired, the clay hardened into enduring shapes, often retaining faint fingerprints of the maker, a soft human trace that suggested care and intimacy, rather than drama or spectacle. These figures were sometimes arranged in domestic shrines or tombs, forming miniature tableaus that quietly mirrored the structures of life above and beyond the physical realm. Pigments, if applied, were subdued, derived from mineral sources, offering gentle ochres, dusty greens, or muted reds, each whispering a barely perceptible note of color to accompany the otherwise earthy surfaces. Let us drift slowly, almost lazily, over the imagining of a craftsman's hand smoothing the curves of a servant's robe, tracing the soft rise of a horse's haunch, pressing gently into the clay until the figure seems to breathe softly, in miniature, in its quiet, enduring way. The clay figurines of this period are not thrilling. Not even a little. And that is exactly the kind of calm, unhurried presence we are meant to appreciate. By roughly 400 years into our time, in Egypt, clay figurines continued to hold a quiet, enduring role in both tomb and household rituals, forming part of a long tradition of soft, deliberate companionship for the departed and the living alike. These figures were often small, compact, and shaped with a mindful attention to posture. A kneeling figure might suggest humility, a seated figure calm observation, and animals curled into restful poses conveyed a slow, steady harmony with life. Artisans chose clay carefully, mixing it to a consistent softness, shaping, trimming, and smoothing each contour, and occasionally using simple tools to impress fine lines or gentle indentations that suggested garments or features. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, certain figurines were inscribed with faint symbols or tiny marks, not to tell a story in the conventional sense, but perhaps to mark ownership, ritual significance, or simply to leave a human signature, a subtle reminder of someone's slow, careful attention. Once fired in low-temperature kilns, these figures acquired a muted, earthy warmth and a tactile presence that remained quietly comforting, whether placed upon a shelf, near a hearth, or alongside the sarcophagus of a recently departed family member. Often, pigments were sparingly applied, the colors never bold, but harmonizing with the natural tones of the clay, blending gently into the ambient light, so that the figures seemed almost to melt into the surrounding space rather than command notice. Let us drift ever so slowly, imagining a small, hollow figurine being carried by soft hands, settled into a corner with care, where it would quietly endure for centuries, witnessing nothing, feeling nothing, yet silently embodying the rhythms of lives long past, like the gentle turning of a distant, unmoving clock, always present, always calm. Around 450 years into our time, in India, terracotta figurines began to represent both humans and deities in an understated, meticulous manner. These figures were shaped with the softest attention to proportion, posture, and small gestures, the artist's hands moving slowly over the clay, smoothing, pinching, and refining until each figure possessed a quiet integrity. Deities were usually rendered in reposeful poses, hands lifted or folded in ways that were symbolic, yet restrained, never dramatic, their form suggesting a presence more contemplative than commanding. Humans were depicted in the ordinary activities of daily life, from tending animals to performing domestic tasks, their postures rendered with a subtle grace, so that the figurine could exist as a soft, unhurried echo of lived experience. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, some figurines carried tiny incised patterns, marking garments, jewelry, or symbolic motifs, which required careful, repeated scraping with fine tools, leaving almost imperceptible marks that can still be felt if one runs a gentle finger along the surface today. The clay was often fired in small kilns, yielding a muted palette of gentle reds, soft oranges, and calm browns, and while not uniform, each variation was quietly embraced, forming a subtle, sleepy harmony across collections. Let us float gently onward, picturing rows of these figurines resting on low shelves, or quietly placed in shallow niches, each one a miniature companion, entirely unassuming, yet full of deliberate detail, the product of countless soft, repetitive motions that required patience, precision, and a lingering affection for the unremarkable, but quietly enduring, shapes of life itself. By about 500 years of our time, in China, clay figurines became increasingly standardized in design, as if the craft itself had learned to settle into gentle repetition, favoring uniformity while retaining the soft charm of handcrafted imperfection. Soldiers, attendants, and animals were shaped with a carefully observed consistency, so that one might compare one figure to the next and notice the subtle rhythm of recurring details, the curve of a sleeve, the tilt of a head, the slight arch of an animal's back. Standardization allowed for easier production, yet each figure retained faint traces of the maker's fingers, a small whisper of human presence preserved in the otherwise quiet, formal lines of the clay. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact. Sometimes molds were reused dozens of times, yet the clay's natural variation ensured that no two figures were ever exactly alike, each quietly distinct in weight, texture, and the soft play of its contours. Once fired, the figurines possessed a delicate warmth and earthy tone, resting patiently in homes, shrines, or tombs, where they maintained a subtle presence, neither demanding attention nor seeking notice, but simply existing. Let us drift slowly along the imagined motions of hands kneading clay, pressing into molds, smoothing edges, and adjusting tiny details with barely perceptible care, until each figure is complete, an unassuming companion that occupies space softly, quietly, and persistently, like a gentle exhalation across centuries. Around 550 years of our time, in Rome, clay figurines continued to serve domestic decorative purposes, though in a manner far removed from any urgency or spectacle. These figures were small, often depicting humans engaged in simple, ordinary gestures, a woman holding a small vessel, a child crouching, a man seated in quiet repose. The clay itself was soft, often slightly sandy, requiring patient shaping, gentle smoothing, and careful handling to prevent cracks during the slow firing process. Pigments, when applied, were understated, derived from earth minerals, producing pale ochres, soft reds, and dusty creams, the colors blending with muted shadows in quiet corners of homes. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact. The placement of these figurines was sometimes deliberate, arranged along shelves or on low ledges to create subtle repetitions of form, so that the eye might glide gently over them without pausing, absorbing calmness rather than narrative. Let us drift, ever so slowly, over the shaping, firing, and arranging, imagining each figure as it rested in quiet solidarity, enduring the passing of time with gentle presence, neither noticed by most, yet offering a tiny whisper of domestic artistry for those willing to observe. The tactile details of clay, slight imperfections, and gentle curves all contribute to the quiet, enduring charm of these small companions, present but unobtrusive, like the soft shadow of leaves drifting across a still pond. By roughly 600 years into our time, in India, miniature figurines were crafted to depict both animals and mythological beings, rendered in unhurried, meticulous fashion. The clay was kneaded and rolled, often with faint traces of water or slip to enhance pliability, and then shaped slowly, finger by finger, into figures whose postures were deliberate and calming. Animals were represented in repose, a cow curling its legs beneath it, a bird folding its wings in gentle rest, each line of clay suggesting a quiet stillness that the eye might linger upon with soft appreciation. Mythological beings were depicted with symbolic features, subtle gestures, and carefully proportioned forms, intended not to astonish, but to suggest presence and continuity in miniature. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact. Some figures were perforated or hollowed, perhaps for ritual offerings or to reduce cracking, leaving small, almost imperceptible cavities that invite slow, patient observation. Firing in low, steady kilns imparted muted, earthy tones, and occasional soft brushwork added delicate hints of pigment, never vibrant, always subdued, blending harmoniously with the natural clay color. Let us drift, ever so gently, over the imagining of a small hand pressing, smoothing, and shaping each figure, until the animal or being emerges fully formed yet entirely unassuming, a quiet companion that occupies space with tender patience, inviting the mind to rest slowly, thoughtfully, and without hurry. Around 650 years into our time, in China, clay figurines were often placed gently within tombs, intended to offer quiet protection for those who had passed from the world above into the soft, enveloping earth. These figures were made from local clay, carefully kneaded and molded into forms representing humans, animals, and occasionally hybrid creatures whose features were softened by the slow, deliberate shaping process. Fingers traced tiny folds in garments, pressed gently to form subtle curves and limbs, and the figures were allowed to rest in naturalistic postures that suggested calmness and stillness, rather than vigor or movement. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, artisans sometimes hollowed the figurines, leaving minute cavities that might have held symbolic offerings, small grains, or even tiny traces of organic material, which over centuries quietly decomposed, leaving only the faintest memory in the clay itself. Once placed within tombs, the figures occupied a softly defined space, arranged according to ritualistic traditions that were likely familiar to the living, but nearly invisible to the casual observer, a quiet choreography of care that endured unseen. The surface of the figurines often retained faint fingerprints, subtle ridges, and gentle impressions left by the tools used to shape them, and if one were to imagine sunlight filtering softly through a distant window or torchlight flickering in a tomb corridor, these surfaces would catch the illumination in muted, restful tones. Let us drift, ever so gently, over the shaping, firing, and careful placement of these tiny companions, understanding that their purpose was neither spectacle nor artifice, but a serene, patient continuity between life and the slow embrace of the earth, a whisper of guardianship rendered in the softest of materials. By roughly 700 years into our time, in Europe, clay figurines began appearing in early medieval settlements, scattered quietly across domestic and ritual spaces, each small form shaped with understated attention to detail. These figurines were modest in size, often representing humans in the ordinary motions of daily life, though occasionally hinting at symbolic or protective roles that were familiar within local traditions. The clay was mixed and kneaded to a consistency that allowed for gentle shaping, smoothed by fingers or simple tools, and then left to dry slowly, sometimes under the faint warmth of a hearth or within a shaded workspace. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, the color of the clay was rarely altered, remaining in soft ochres and gentle earth tones, which blended naturally with the muted interiors of homes or communal spaces, creating a quiet, almost meditative harmony between object and environment. Figurines were sometimes hollowed or punctured, perhaps to reduce cracking during firing, or to allow small offerings to be inserted, adding a subtle ritual dimension that is only noticeable upon very patient observation. Let us drift, softly and contemplatively, over the imagined hands of early medieval artisans, pressing, smoothing, and refining the clay until each figure rests in a posture that suggests calm attentiveness, rather than action or excitement, quietly occupying its small, ordered space in settlements that themselves moved slowly through the rhythms of daily life. The figurines, though unassuming, formed a persistent presence, echoing the gentle, repetitive motions of shaping, drying, and arranging, a tiny testament to patient human care amidst the quiet, moss-covered landscapes of early medieval Europe. Around 750 years into our time, in China, clay figurines began to reflect regional artistic styles, soft distinctions that emerged slowly across provinces and local workshops. Figures were shaped with subtle variations in posture, proportion, and detailing, often inspired by the particular aesthetics of a region, the curve of a robe, the shape of a headgear, the tiny folds in a garment, all suggesting a languid attention to local taste. The clay itself was prepared meticulously, sometimes mixed with fine sand to aid pliability, and shaped gently by hands that worked with slow, repetitive motions. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact. Some workshops favored very slight indentation patterns or faint carvings that could be seen only upon careful inspection, perhaps meant to denote origin, workshop, or an artisan's soft signature, a detail easily overlooked by anyone not paying particular attention. Once fired in modest kilns, the figurines acquired a warm, earthen tone, their surfaces quietly bearing the tactile traces of soft fingertips and subtle tool marks. These objects were often used in both domestic settings and tombs, the placement deliberate but unhurried, contributing to a gentle harmony in the spaces they occupied. Let us drift, slowly and attentively, over the shaping, smoothing, and firing processes, allowing the mind to imagine the repetition of motions, the warmth of the kiln, and the quiet, persistent patience of artisans who devoted themselves to small, unassuming, and enduring forms. These figurines, with their regional subtleties, remind us that even in repetition and apparent uniformity, there exists a kind of soft, meditative individuality, a slow whisper of human presence preserved in clay. By around 800 years of our time, in India, clay figurines were widely produced for ritual use, their creation a patient repetition of form and gesture designed to facilitate ceremonies that were neither urgent nor dramatic, but deliberate and calming. Artisans kneaded and pressed the clay, shaping human figures, animals, and hybrid forms with a careful attention to posture, proportion, and the faintest suggestion of expression. Small tools were employed to impress details, folds in garments, faint lines to indicate hair, the soft suggestion of eyes or mouth, all minimal yet sufficient to define a subtle presence. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact. In some cases, figurines were intentionally hollowed, creating internal cavities that reduced cracking during firing, and perhaps offered tiny spaces for offerings, incense, or symbolic objects, now long vanished but gently remembered by the clay. Firing occurred in controlled kilns, imparting warm, muted tones that harmonized with the soft natural hues of domestic or ritual spaces. Let us drift, ever so gently, over the shaping, drying, and firing, contemplating the repetition of motions, the careful smoothing, and the patient attention to small details that rendered each figurine quietly significant in its own right. These miniature companions, though entirely unassuming, were arranged for rituals in ways that reinforced quiet order, soft repetition, and unobtrusive presence, a testament to centuries of care and a whisper of continuity between maker, figure, and ritual, all unfolding slowly like drifting feathers upon a still, mossy surface. These figures were shaped from clay with gentle, repetitive attention, emphasizing calm postures and subtle, symbolic gestures, such as folded hands or serene standing positions. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact. Artisans sometimes used very fine tools to inscribe delicate patterns or subtle symbols on robes, halos, or bases, marks so faint that only the most patient eye would notice, yet they provided a whisper of sacred intent. Firing in warm kilns ensured a muted, earthy coloration, sometimes enhanced by subdued pigments derived from mineral sources, creating gentle ochres, faint reds, and soft creams. Figurines were placed in domestic shrines or quiet corners of homes, observing daily life without demanding attention, their presence a slow, steady reminder of devotion. Let us drift softly over the careful shaping, smoothing, and firing, imagining hands moving rhythmically, fingers pressing and refining with quiet repetition, until each saintly figure rests calmly, an unobtrusive companion to both household and ritual, radiating gentle stillness, patiently enduring through centuries as a subtle, persistent presence, like the soft shadow of a slowly turning gear in a sunlit room. Around 900 years into our time, in China, clay figurines were utilized for both household and burial purposes, quietly bridging the realms of the living and the departed. Artisans kneaded clay with patient hands, shaping humans, animals, and occasionally hybrid forms with a careful attention to posture, proportion, and the faintest suggestion of expression. Small tools were used to smooth surfaces, create folds in garments, and leave barely perceptible marks that spoke to the maker's presence. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact. Some figurines were perforated or hollowed, providing structural stability during firing, or perhaps allowing symbolic offerings, tiny traces of which are sometimes detectable by careful study today. The firing process imparted warm, earthy hues, from gentle browns to muted reds, softening the overall appearance and allowing the figurines to blend seamlessly into domestic settings or tomb interiors. Let us drift, ever so softly, over the repetition of shaping, smoothing, and arranging, appreciating the quiet persistence of these figures, neither commanding attention nor fading entirely, but resting in steady, enduring calm. Their small, unobtrusive presence invites reflection on continuity, care, and patience, a gentle reminder that even the most modest objects can carry enduring significance, quietly bridging time, space, and human attention. By roughly 950 years into our time, in India, miniature figurines were crafted to depict domestic and ritual scenes, small tableaus of life preserved in soft, unassuming clay. Human figures were shaped in ordinary actions, tending animals, preparing meals, or performing quiet gestures of ceremony, each form gently suggesting motion frozen in stillness. Animals were curled, resting, or depicted in subtle postures that indicated calm observation rather than activity. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact. Many figurines were hollowed or contained minute cavities, likely to prevent cracking during firing, and perhaps to allow ritual materials, such as grains or tiny offerings, to be placed within, a practice almost entirely forgotten, yet quietly encoded in the clay. Firing imparted a gentle warmth, soft reds, ochres, and muted browns that harmonized with interior spaces and ritual environments, the color remaining subdued rather than expressive, allowing the forms themselves to quietly dominate perception. Let us float, ever so slowly, through the imagined motions of kneading, pressing, smoothing, and refining, appreciating the soft repetition and attentive care that brought each miniature scene to life, not in spectacle, but in tender, enduring quiet. The figurines, modest and unassuming, exist as patient witnesses of domesticity and ritual, a gentle whisper of continuity preserved in small, earthen shapes, softly inviting the mind to linger, relax, and drift into quiet contemplation. By roughly 1,000 years of our time, in Europe, medieval clay figurines represented saints and religious figures, softly asserting presence through delicate posture and subtle gestures, rather than through elaborate ornamentation or overt narrative. Artisans shaped these small objects with careful, repeated attention, smoothing contours, refining proportions, and imprinting minute details that might suggest robes, hands folded in quiet prayer, or faintly inscribed halos. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact. The placement of these figurines was often considered thoughtfully, whether on shelves in private homes, within small chapels, or in domestic shrines, forming miniature sanctuaries of calm observation and gentle reverence. The clay, once fired in modest kilns, acquired soft earthy tones, sometimes enhanced with faint, muted pigments, creating a gentle visual harmony that did not call attention, but rather invited quiet contemplation. Let us drift gently over the imagined hands of artisans, pressing, smoothing, and refining, until each saintly form rests unobtrusively, a small companion to domestic devotion or meditative reflection. These medieval figurines, quietly enduring, carry the soft legacy of centuries of careful attention, patience, and subtle reverence, offering an invitation to rest the eyes, settle the mind, and linger softly in the gentle presence of unassuming yet deliberate craftsmanship. Around 1,050 years of our time, in China, clay figurines became softly integrated into Buddhist temple rituals, quietly accompanying the meditative rhythms of prayer, incense smoke, and gentle chants. Artisans prepared the clay with careful, repeated kneading, smoothing, and shaping, creating figures of seated monks, attendants, and symbolic animals, each designed to hold a subtle presence rather than command attention. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, some figures were perforated with tiny holes or hollowed slightly, allowing for incense or ritual offerings to linger in small, unseen spaces, a delicate whisper of interaction between the physical object and spiritual intent. Pigments derived from minerals were applied sparingly, in soft ochres, muted reds, and gentle greens, carefully brushed to avoid overt brightness, enhancing folds in robes, the delicate contours of hands, or the barely perceptible tilt of a head. Once fired in low, consistent kilns, the figurines assumed a subtle warmth, their tactile surfaces retaining faint traces of finger impressions and the gentle marks of simple tools. The placement of these figures within temples followed ritual guidelines, along shelves, near altars, or within small niches, where they quietly reinforced the contemplative atmosphere. Let us drift, ever so softly, over the shaping, smoothing, painting, and arranging of each miniature companion, imagining the soft repetition of motions, the faint earthy smell of fired clay, and the slow, patient devotion embedded in every curve. These figurines, entirely unassuming yet meticulously crafted, exist as small, enduring witnesses to spiritual practice, patiently observing the soft rhythm of temple life, offering subtle presence rather than spectacle, a quiet continuum of human care across time. Around 1100 years of our time, in India, terracotta figurines were crafted to illustrate daily life and traditions, forming gentle snapshots of domestic and communal activity, captured in soft, pliable clay. Artisans kneaded, rolled, and pressed the clay with repetitive care, shaping humans, animals, and hybrid forms with attention to posture, proportion, and understated expression. Figures might depict farmers tending their fields, women carrying vessels, children in repose, or animals at rest, each form rendered with a slow, deliberate attention to calm detail. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, sometimes the figurines bore tiny, incised patterns, perhaps representing textiles, jewelry, or symbolic motifs, created with delicate tools so subtle that the impressions are almost imperceptible, requiring a soft and patient eye to notice. Once shaped, the clay was dried carefully, often in shaded areas or gentle sunlight, before firing in kilns at measured temperatures, producing muted earthy tones that harmonized with domestic interiors or ritual spaces. Occasionally, soft pigments were applied, drawn from mineral or organic sources, adding quiet hints of color that emphasized robes, hair, or minor details without disturbing the overall calm of the form. Let us drift, slowly and softly, over the shaping, smoothing, and firing, imagining hands repeatedly pressing, shaping, and refining, until the figures rested gently in their assigned spaces, whether near hearths, shrines, or communal tables. These terracotta companions, modest and unobtrusive, quietly preserve the gestures and domestic rhythms of their time, offering a patient reflection of human care and continuity that can be appreciated only through slow observation, soft contemplation, and a gentle imagination that allows every small, crafted detail to linger quietly in the mind. By roughly 1150 years into our time, in Europe, clay figurines were crafted primarily for domestic devotional use, small objects designed to accompany prayer, meditation, or quiet reflection within the home. Artisans kneaded clay until soft and pliable, then molded tiny human figures, angels, and symbolic motifs with careful, repetitive motions that emphasized gentle posture, subtle gestures, and smooth surfaces. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, many figurines were created with small hollowed spaces or incisions, perhaps to reduce cracking during firing, or to allow faint ritual offerings to be placed, leaving traces that only the most patient observer might perceive. Once shaped, Figurines were fired in low-temperature kilns, producing muted browns, soft ochres, and gentle reddish hues that harmonized with the domestic interiors of early medieval homes. In some cases, minimal pigments were applied, brushing softly over robes, faces, or halos, enhancing detail without ever creating brightness or spectacle. Let us drift gently, imagining the soft pressing, smoothing, and shaping, the careful refinement of posture, the subtle attention to hands, feet, and faces, and the patient repetition that imbued each figure with quiet presence. Placed on shelves, near hearths, or in domestic shrines, these figurines observed human life with stillness and constancy, offering calm companionship without disturbance, and gently preserving the forms, gestures, and symbolic markers of domestic devotion. The repetition of care, subtle detailing, and deliberate positioning creates a quiet rhythm, a slow, enduring whisper of human attention embodied in small, unobtrusive clay forms, each patiently enduring the soft passage of time, unnoticed yet persistently present. Around 1200 years of our time, in China, clay figurines became increasingly detailed and painted, their forms refined through careful shaping, smoothing, and gentle decorative application. Artisans worked the clay with repeated, tender motions, creating human, animal, and symbolic figures that carried a serene, restful presence. Pigments were applied sparingly, with soft mineral-derived reds, ochres, greens, and muted blues, following the folds of garments, the subtle curvature of limbs, or the delicate gestures of hands and heads. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, certain figurines were designed with very fine hollowed spaces, possibly to prevent cracking in the kiln, or to allow faint ritual or symbolic insertion of small objects, grains, or organic materials that would quietly decay over time, leaving faint traces of former presence. Firing took place in controlled, low-temperature kilns, producing warm, earthy surfaces with faint finger impressions, gentle ridges, and subtle tool marks that preserved the intimate dialogue between maker and clay. Let us drift, softly, through the shaping, smoothing, painting, and finishing processes, imagining the patient repetition, the rhythm of hands, and the quiet atmosphere of workshops where figures rested and waited before their final placement. Figurines were arranged in temples, domestic spaces, and small shrines, offering unobtrusive companionship, neither demanding attention nor asserting narrative, but quietly maintaining presence, a gentle echo of human care, skill, and continuity that can only be fully appreciated in slow, unhurried observation, allowing the mind to float calmly across every soft, meticulous contour. Around 1250 years of our time, in India, clay figurines were employed in festival and ritual practices, shaped with careful, repetitive attention to human and divine forms, animals, and symbolic creatures. Artisans kneaded clay to achieve consistent softness, then pressed, molded, and smoothed each figure with patient fingers, often incorporating subtle gestures, nuanced postures, and fine detailing of garments, hair, or implements. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, hollowed cavities or faint incisions were sometimes made in figurines, potentially for offerings, symbolic significance, or structural stability during firing, leaving traces that endure subtly for modern observation. Pigments, derived from muted mineral sources, were applied gently to robes, hair, and minor features, never vivid, always subdued, blending harmoniously with the natural clay tones. Firing occurred in low, controlled kilns, producing warm, earthy surfaces, sometimes punctuated by soft highlights of color, emphasizing small details rather than overarching spectacle. Let us drift slowly, contemplatively, over the imagined repetitive shaping, smoothing, decorating, and firing, envisioning the gentle rhythm of hands moving over pliable clay, imprinting calm attention, and resting the figurines carefully for ritual display. These objects were arranged in festival spaces, near altars, or in domestic shrines, quietly embodying symbolic presence, celebrating both ordinary and ceremonial life, offering a patient reflection of human care, repetition, and the serene endurance of cultural continuity, preserved softly, gently, and meticulously in each small, unassuming terracotta form. Around 1300 years of our time, in Europe, terracotta figurines depicted saints, angels, and domestic life, crafted with meticulous care and soft, patient repetition. The clay was kneaded and shaped into gentle postures, subtle gestures, and calm expressions, often refined with simple tools to create delicate folds in garments or tiny facial impressions. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact. Some figurines were perforated or hollowed, possibly to prevent cracking during firing, or to provide small spaces for symbolic offerings, a detail that has quietly endured across centuries. Pigments were occasionally applied, in muted ochres, soft reds, or gentle whites, enhancing folds, gestures, and hair, all while maintaining a subdued, restful palette. Firing produced warm, earthy surfaces, retaining faint traces of fingers and tool marks, a slow testament to the quiet attentiveness of their makers. Let us drift, ever so gently, over the shaping, smoothing, and firing, imagining shelves lined with these tiny companions, observing domestic life and devotional practice with silent consistency, unassuming yet fully present. Each figurine embodies repetition, patient care, and gentle artistry, quietly enduring, offering soft, unhurried presence that invites the mind to linger slowly, to notice the subtle rhythms of human attention preserved delicately in small, terracotta forms, drifting gently across space and time, like leaves settling softly upon mossy earth. Around 1350 years of our time, in China, clay figurines began to reflect folk art and religious beliefs, softly blending everyday representation with symbolic meaning, capturing gestures, postures, and attire with tender attention. Artisans kneaded clay to a pliable consistency, gently shaping figures of humans, animals, and mythic creatures, smoothing edges, forming subtle contours, and refining minute details with patient, repetitive care. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact. Some figurines were hollowed or lightly perforated, allowing airflow during firing, structural stability, or symbolic inclusion of small ritual elements, now vanished but faintly traceable through careful study. Pigments, applied sparingly, followed gentle folds of garments, softly accentuated hair, or hinted at symbolic motifs, always subdued and harmonious with the natural clay, never intrusive. Firing in steady, moderate kilns imparted warm, earthy tones, retaining the faint finger impressions and soft tool marks of their makers, a quiet testament to human patience. Let us drift gently, imagining hands shaping, smoothing, and finishing each figure, before arranging them carefully in shrines, homes, or temples, offering unobtrusive companionship, subtly observing rituals, domestic life, and belief practices, a slow, enduring whisper of human care captured in clay, present without demand, soft without spectacle, and quietly persistent across generations. By around 1400 years of our time, in India, terracotta figurines were increasingly mass-produced for local markets, though production remained methodical, careful, and deliberate rather than hurried or careless. Clay was kneaded to soft, workable consistency, rolled, molded, and pressed into forms representing humans, animals, and deities, each figure shaped to maintain gentle proportions, calm postures, and subtle expression. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact. Hollowing or perforation was frequently employed to reduce cracking in kilns or to allow small ritual elements to be inserted, a practice quietly repeated across workshops, leaving faint, enduring traces. Pigments, soft and muted, were applied sparingly, following folds in clothing or contours of limbs, never bright, never attention-grabbing, but quietly harmonious. Firing in warm kilns produced earthy surfaces, retaining fingerprints, tool marks, and minor variations that preserved individuality even within standardized forms. Let us drift ever so slowly, imagining hands shaping, smoothing, and finishing row upon row of figurines, each resting patiently for sale, ritual, or domestic display, quietly carrying subtle reflections of culture, care, and enduring attention. The figurines, small, unobtrusive, and carefully arranged, offer a persistent yet gentle presence, a soft whisper of human craftsmanship, patience, and continuity, quietly inviting reflection, calm, and gentle observation. Around 1450 years of our time, in Europe, clay figurines found their quiet place within household shrines, softly accompanying domestic devotional practices with gentle presence and subtle form. Artisans kneaded and pressed clay with slow, repetitive care, shaping tiny saints, angels, and symbolic figures with calm attention to posture, proportion, and the faintest suggestion of expression, allowing each figure to embody quiet reverence rather than commanding spectacle. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, many figurines were hollowed or lightly perforated, a practical measure to prevent cracking during firing, but also a subtle invitation for ritual or symbolic materials to occupy the small internal spaces, a quiet interaction between human intent and clay that may be perceptible only upon careful, patient observation. Pigments, softly derived from mineral or organic sources, were applied sparingly, enhancing robes, hair, or halos in muted reds, ochres, and gentle whites, never bright, always in harmony with the natural earthen tones of the clay. Firing occurred in low-temperature kilns, producing warm surfaces that retained delicate impressions of fingers and tools, faint traces of the patient human touch that shaped each figure. Let us drift slowly and softly over the imagined rhythm of shaping, smoothing, and finishing, the quiet repetition of hands pressing and refining, until each figurine rests unassumingly within its domestic shrine, observing, comforting, and participating in the subtle rhythm of daily life. These small objects, modest yet deliberate, offer a persistent and gentle presence, quietly linking generations of care, devotion, and craftsmanship, soft witnesses to the slow passage of time. By around 1500 years of our time, in China, figurines were created for both spiritual and decorative purposes, softly bridging the contemplative and the ornamental in domestic, temple, and communal spaces. Clay was prepared carefully, kneaded to a pliable consistency, and molded with patient, repetitive gestures to produce figures of humans, animals, and occasionally mythological forms, each small shape reflecting balance, proportion, and understated posture. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, some figures were hollowed or punctured, creating minute cavities, sometimes for practical reasons like kiln firing stability, or perhaps to allow symbolic or ritual items to be subtly inserted, leaving faint traces that endure across centuries. Gentle pigments, derived from mineral or organic sources, were applied in soft, subdued tones, accentuating folds of robes, faint gestures, or subtle facial features without disturbing the calm natural warmth of the clay. Firing in moderate kilns imparted muted earthen hues, retaining fingerprints, gentle tool impressions, and slight surface irregularities that whispered of human attention and repetitive care. Let us drift, ever so softly, through the shaping, painting, and firing processes, imagining the quiet rhythm of hands smoothing, forming, and refining, until each figure is placed with deliberate care in temples, homes, or display spaces. These figurines, entirely unassuming yet meticulously crafted, provide subtle spiritual companionship and gentle aesthetic pleasure, quietly observing daily life or meditative practice, a soft testament to centuries of patient artistry and careful attention, bridging ritual, decoration, and calm presence in the slow continuum of human experience. Around 1550 years of our time, in India, clay figurines were crafted both for trade and for ritual, slowly and meticulously shaped with calm, repetitive gestures by artisans who devoted attention to posture, proportion, and the faintest nuance of expression. Human figures, animals, and divine forms were kneaded, pressed, and smoothed with patient care, each small shape intended to inhabit ritual spaces, domestic shrines, or local marketplaces without demand, offering quiet presence rather than spectacle. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, hollowed cavities and subtle incisions were often included, not merely for structural stability during firing, but also perhaps to accommodate offerings, grains, or symbolic items, now long vanished but leaving faint traces of former utility. Pigments, soft and muted, were applied sparingly, highlighting folds of garments, subtle facial features, or small symbolic motifs, blending harmoniously with the natural warmth of the clay. Firing occurred in carefully controlled kilns, producing earthy tones with faint traces of fingerprints and tool marks, tiny testimonies of human care. Let us drift, gently and unhurriedly, over the shaping, smoothing, painting, and firing, imagining the patient rhythm of hands pressing, refining, and finishing each figure, before it is arranged softly for ritual display or market presentation. These figurines, modest yet deliberate, quietly preserve gestures, practices, and cultural continuity, a soft echo of human attention preserved in unassuming clay, present without demand, and entirely at peace with the gentle flow of daily life. By around 1600 years of our time, in Europe, terracotta figurines reflected Renaissance artistic styles, slowly absorbing influences of proportion, perspective, and subtle narrative gestures into their soft forms. Artisans kneaded clay until pliable, then molded figures with gentle attention to posture, detail, and calm expression, often depicting humans, saints, or domestic animals in quiet, restful poses. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, some figurines were hollowed or perforated, likely to prevent cracking in kilns, but also possibly to allow minuscule offerings, symbolic grains, or ritual elements to be added, leaving traces only perceptible to patient observers. Pigments were applied subtly, enhancing garments, hair, or faces with muted reds, ochres, soft whites, or gentle blues, harmonizing with the earthy clay, and allowing light to play softly across the surface. Firing occurred in controlled, moderate temperature kilns, producing warm, tactile surfaces that retained slight finger impressions, tool marks, and subtle imperfections that testified to the slow attentiveness of their makers. Let us drift, softly, over the shaping, smoothing, detailing, and finishing, imagining hands moving in quiet repetition, producing small objects that rest unobtrusively in domestic shrines or displays. These terracotta figures, entirely modest yet carefully crafted, embody patient skill, subtle artistry, and soft continuity, quietly bridging human intention, domestic devotion, and aesthetic sensibility, present without demand, and enduring through the calm passage of time. By around 1650 years of our time, in China, clay figurines reflected the aesthetics of the Ming dynasty, softly combining realistic human and animal forms with decorative, symbolic, and subtle narrative elements. Artisans kneaded clay to a supple consistency, shaping figures in quiet repetition, paying careful attention to proportions, posture, and minimal facial expression, while occasionally imprinting faint motifs or inscriptions with small, delicate tools. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, many figurines contained hollowed cavities, sometimes for firing stability, sometimes perhaps for small symbolic insertions, leaving traces that can be detected by attentive observation. Pigments, derived from subdued mineral sources, were applied sparingly to enhance robes, hair, or subtle accessories, never bright, always harmonizing with the natural warmth of the clay. Firing in steady, moderate temperature kilns imparted muted earthen tones, soft reds, gentle browns, and ochres, while preserving the faint fingerprints and tool impressions of their makers. Let us drift, gently and contemplatively, over the shaping, smoothing, painting, and firing, imagining hands moving repetitively, patiently refining each form, before the figures are placed in domestic, ritual, or temple spaces. These small, unassuming figurines embody patient care, aesthetic subtlety, and enduring presence, quietly observing life and ritual, offering soft companionship, and linking the attentive work of the maker with centuries of calm, ceremonial, and domestic continuity. By around 1700 years of our time, in India, clay figurines were widely produced for both cultural and ritual purposes, shaped patiently and repetitively to depict humans, animals, and symbolic forms, often incorporating subtle gestures and refined postures that suggested calm and continuity rather than narrative drama. Artisans kneaded and pressed clay gently, smoothing surfaces, shaping contours, and occasionally incising faint details to indicate clothing folds, hair, or small symbolic marks. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, hollowing, perforation, or minute internal cavities were sometimes included, providing structural stability during firing or allowing small symbolic offerings, long vanished but faintly traceable in the clay. Pigments, soft and muted, were applied sparingly to garments, hair, or accessories, emphasizing contours without disturbing the natural warmth of the clay. Firing occurred in steady kilns, producing soft earthy tones, preserving faint finger impressions and tool marks. Let us drift, ever so slowly, over the shaping, smoothing, decorating, and firing, imagining the patient, rhythmic motions of hands refining each figure, before it is placed gently in ritual spaces, shrines, or communal settings. These figurines, modest and unassuming, quietly preserve cultural gestures, domestic habits, and ceremonial practices, offering gentle companionship and soft continuity, enduring across time without demand, entirely at peace in their small, deliberate existence. Around 1750 years of our time, in Europe, miniature clay figurines became popular as decorative objects, softly occupying shelves, cabinets, and domestic niches, their presence neither commanding nor narrative, but quietly ornamental. Artisans kneaded clay to gentle pliability, shaping humans, animals, or symbolic motifs with repeated, attentive gestures, smoothing surfaces and refining proportions, posture, and minimal expression. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, some figurines were hollowed, perforated, or slightly inscribed, perhaps for kiln stability, symbolic purpose, or ritual accommodation, leaving faint traces detectable only through patient observation. Pigments, applied sparingly in muted reds, ochres, and soft whites, accentuated robes, hair, or minor details, harmonizing with natural clay tones. Firing in moderate kilns produced warm, tactile surfaces that retained subtle fingerprints and tool marks, evidence of careful, repetitive shaping. Let us drift, softly and contemplatively, over the shaping, smoothing, painting, and firing, imagining hands moving rhythmically, patiently, repeatedly, until each figure rests quietly upon a shelf, cabinet, or shrine, offering gentle aesthetic presence, patient companionship, and subtle continuity, quietly enduring across decades of domestic life, a soft testament to deliberate, unhurried craftsmanship, quietly attentive and entirely serene. By around 1800 years of our time, in China, clay figurines were crafted to depict humans, animals, and mythological creatures, softly merging observation, imagination, and symbolic representation. Artisans kneaded clay into soft, workable consistency, shaping figures with calm, repetitive gestures, smoothing surfaces, forming subtle postures, and attending to the faintest impressions of expression, attire, or accessories. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, hollowing or perforation of some figures allowed stability during firing or symbolic inclusion of minute offerings, leaving quiet traces for patient modern observers. Pigments, subdued and mineral-derived, were applied sparingly to robes, hair, or accessories, always harmonious with the warm earth tones of the clay. Firing occurred in steady kilns, imparting muted reds, browns, ochres, and soft creams, preserving gentle fingerprints, tool marks, and minor variations that quietly testify to human attention. Let us drift, ever so softly, over the shaping, smoothing, painting, and firing, imagining the quiet rhythm of hands pressing, forming, and refining each figure, before it rests in domestic, temple, or ritual spaces. These small, unassuming figurines carry the calm imprint of careful craftsmanship, patient repetition, and enduring presence, observing quietly, offering subtle companionship, and linking human attention with centuries of soft, gentle continuity, entirely at ease in their unassuming existence. Around 1820 years of our time, in India, clay figurines were patiently crafted within small village workshops, where artisans worked with soft, pliable clay, kneading it gently and repetitively until it achieved a consistency suitable for molding. Each figure, whether human, animal, or symbolic, was formed with slow, careful attention to posture, proportion, and subtle expression, producing objects that carried quiet presence rather than visual drama. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, many figurines were intentionally hollowed or perforated, both to reduce cracking during firing and occasionally to provide space for tiny symbolic offerings or grains, traces of which can sometimes still be observed under careful inspection. Soft pigments, derived from natural minerals and muted earth tones, were applied sparingly, accentuating folds in clothing, subtle gestures of hands, or faint facial features, harmonizing gently with the warm, tactile surface of the clay. Once shaped and decorated, the figurines were dried carefully in shaded areas or gentle sunlight before being fired in small kilns, producing warm, earthy hues and retaining faint fingerprints and tool marks, quiet witnesses to the repetitive care of their makers. Let us drift, ever so softly, through the shaping, smoothing, painting, and firing, imagining the patient rhythm of hands moving over pliable clay, softly imprinting human attention into each figure. Arranged on shelves, near hearths, or in small shrines, these figurines observed domestic life and ritual practice with unassuming presence, quietly linking human intention with enduring material form. By around 1850 years of our time, in Europe, terracotta figurines continued to serve domestic decoration, modestly enhancing the calm interiors of homes with their gentle shapes and quiet artistry. Artisans kneaded clay until soft and pliable, molding figures with slow, repetitive gestures, attending carefully to proportions, postures, and subtle facial impressions, allowing each form to embody gentle presence without spectacle. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, some figurines were designed with small hollowed interiors, perhaps to prevent cracking in kilns, or to allow faint symbolic inclusion of grains, tiny offerings, or even delicate incense fragments, leaving traces that whisper of long-vanished practices. Pigments, derived from subdued mineral sources, were applied sparingly in muted ochres, soft reds, and gentle whites, enhancing folds, hair, or delicate gestures without ever disturbing the natural warmth of the clay. Firing took place in low to moderate temperature kilns, producing earthy surfaces that retained fingerprints, tool marks, and subtle imperfections, small traces of the patient attentiveness of their makers. Let us drift, gently, imagining the shaping, smoothing, painting, and firing, the slow repetition of hands moving rhythmically across pliable clay, and the quiet placement of figurines upon shelves, mantelpieces, or domestic shrines. These objects, modest yet carefully crafted, quietly preserve human attention, domestic ritual, and aesthetic continuity, offering calm presence without demand, a subtle witness to the passage of time, and a soft echo of careful, repetitive craft. By around 1870 years of our time, in China, clay figurines were refined for both artistic and ceremonial purposes, softly merging traditional forms with the aesthetic sensibilities of the period, emphasizing balance, proportion, and understated gesture. Artisans kneaded clay until pliable, then molded human, animal, and symbolic figures with slow, repetitive gestures, smoothing edges, shaping postures, and attending minutely to details such as folds of clothing, facial contours, or subtle accessories. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, hollowing or perforation was sometimes incorporated to prevent cracking during firing, or perhaps to allow small ritual elements or grains to inhabit the figurine, leaving faint traces that only the most attentive observer might notice. Pigments, derived from muted mineral sources, were applied with restraint, highlighting subtle contours, clothing folds, or gentle features while blending harmoniously with the natural warmth of the clay. Firing occurred in moderate kilns, producing soft earthy tones and retaining fingerprints, tool marks, and slight surface irregularities, small whispers of the patient hands that shaped each figure. Let us drift softly and contemplatively over the shaping, smoothing, detailing, and firing, imagining hands moving repetitively, attentively, until each figurine rests quietly in ceremonial spaces, temples, or domestic niches. These figures, entirely unassuming yet meticulously crafted, offer subtle companionship, patient artistry, and enduring continuity, gently linking human care, cultural expression, and ceremonial presence across time in a calm and quietly persistent manner. By around 1900 years of our time, in India, clay figurines were widely produced for religious festivals, shaped with attentive repetition to depict humans, animals, deities, and symbolic forms, often incorporating subtle gestures, nuanced postures, and faint facial expressions. Artisans kneaded and pressed the clay gently, smoothing surfaces, refining contours, and sometimes incising minute details to indicate garments, hair, or ritual symbols, emphasizing calm precision rather than flamboyant display. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, hollowed interiors or small perforations were often used, both for kiln stability and for the quiet insertion of symbolic items, grains, or offerings, leaving delicate traces for the patient observer. Pigments, derived from natural mineral sources, were applied sparingly, emphasizing folds of clothing, subtle gestures, or symbolic motifs, harmonizing gently with the earthy tones of the clay. Firing occurred in carefully controlled kilns, producing warm, tactile surfaces that retained fingerprints, tool marks, and soft irregularities, quiet witnesses to the patient repetition of the artisan's hands. Let us drift gently over the shaping, smoothing, painting, and firing, imagining hands moving with slow rhythm, repeating motions, attending to every minute detail, until the figurines rest in festival spaces, shrines, or domestic displays, offering calm presence, quiet companionship, and enduring reflection of human care. These small objects, unassuming yet deliberate, preserve gestures, rituals, and cultural continuity, softly bridging the attentive work of the maker with centuries of patient practice and ceremonial observation. By around 1920 years of our time, in Europe, clay figurines began to be integrated into early modern art movements, gently bridging traditional terracotta and contemporary artistic exploration. Artisans worked the clay with tender, repetitive gestures, molding figures of humans, animals, or symbolic forms, softly attending to posture, proportion, and understated detail, producing objects that harmonized with domestic, gallery, or devotional spaces without ever demanding attention. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, some figurines were hollowed or perforated, reducing risk of cracking in kilns and occasionally allowing space for symbolic inclusion, faint traces of which endure across decades of observation. Pigments, softly mineral-based, were applied in muted reds, ochres, soft whites, and gentle browns, emphasizing folds, subtle facial features, or accessory details, blending seamlessly with the warm clay. Firing occurred in moderate temperature kilns, producing earthy surfaces that retained fingerprints, tool marks, and faint surface irregularities, subtle echoes of repetitive, careful shaping. Let us drift slowly through the shaping, smoothing, painting, and firing, imagining rhythmic, attentive hands moving over pliable clay, producing figures that rest quietly in domestic, artistic, or devotional spaces, offering calm presence, quiet continuity, and gentle, enduring reflection of human attention, entirely unassuming and softly persistent across time. By around 1940 years of our time, in China, clay figurines continued to exist within traditional and folk art forms, crafted with slow repetition, careful attention, and gentle fidelity to cultural expression. Artisans kneaded soft clay with patience, molding humans, animals, and symbolic figures, smoothing edges, refining contours, and attending minutely to gestures, posture, and subtle expressions. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, hollowing or perforation was still sometimes incorporated, providing stability during firing or symbolic space for offerings or ritual objects, traces of which can be detected by attentive observation. Pigments, muted and mineral-based, were applied sparingly, enhancing folds of clothing, hair, or subtle motifs, harmonizing softly with the warm natural tone of the clay. Firing occurred in moderate kilns, producing earthy surfaces, faintly marked with fingerprints, tool impressions, and slight surface irregularities, each trace a quiet testimony to the patient care of the maker. Let us drift gently and contemplatively over the shaping, smoothing, painting, and firing, imagining hands moving in quiet, repetitive motions, until each figure rests in homes, shrines, or folk art collections, offering gentle presence, subtle continuity, and patient observation of cultural and domestic life, softly bridging human care and enduring artistic tradition. By around 1950 years of our time, in India, mass production of clay figurines began in urban areas, though production remained deliberate, methodical, and attentive rather than hurried or careless. Clay was kneaded to soft pliability, rolled, pressed, and molded into humans, animals, and symbolic forms, each figure shaped to maintain gentle proportion, calm posture, and subtle expression. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, hollowing, perforation, or slight incisions were often incorporated, reducing cracking in kilns or allowing tiny symbolic offerings, leaving faint traces observable only to patient eyes. Pigments, muted and mineral-derived, were applied sparingly to robes, hair, or minor accessories, blending harmoniously with the earthy clay tones. Firing occurred in moderate kilns, producing warm, tactile surfaces that retained fingerprints, tool marks, and minor surface variations, evidence of attentive, repetitive shaping. Let us drift ever so slowly over the shaping, smoothing, painting, and firing, imagining the quiet rhythm of hands moving repetitively, patiently, carefully, until each figurine rests softly in urban shrines, shops, or domestic spaces, quietly preserving gestures, ritual practices, and cultural continuity, offering subtle companionship and gentle presence, entirely serene and unassuming, softly enduring across time. By around 1960 years of our time, in Europe, studio pottery and clay figurine art began to gain gentle popularity, softly bridging centuries of traditional terracotta craft with emerging artistic sensibilities. Artisans, working in quiet studios, kneaded clay with slow, repetitive attention, shaping small figures that ranged from the human and animal form to abstract and symbolic representations, each movement deliberate, each impression on the soft clay a quiet echo of careful practice. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, some artists introduced subtle hollowing or perforations into their figurines, not only to prevent cracking during firing, but also occasionally to accommodate small symbolic or decorative inclusions, traces of which persist faintly even today, visible only to patient observers. Pigments, soft and muted, were applied in a restrained manner, highlighting folds, gestures, and minimal features, harmonizing with the warm, earthen tones of the fired clay. Firing occurred in moderate to carefully controlled kilns, producing surfaces that retained fingerprints, tool marks, and gentle imperfections, each small irregularity a quiet testament to human attention and deliberate repetition. Let us drift, softly and unhurriedly, through the shaping, smoothing, detailing, and firing, imagining the quiet rhythm of hands moving over pliable clay, until each figurine rests on shelves, within cabinets, or in intimate studio displays. These objects, modest yet meticulously shaped, quietly preserve artistic continuity, patient craftsmanship, and aesthetic attentiveness, offering calm presence without demand, softly bridging the old traditions with the quiet curiosity of modern artistic exploration. By around 1970 years of our time, in China, clay figurines were softly employed in both folk art and commercial markets, merging traditional aesthetics with small-scale production for urban consumers and collectors. Artisans kneaded clay carefully, shaping figures with repetitive, slow gestures, attending minutely to posture, proportion, and subtle features, often depicting humans, domestic animals, and symbolic or mythological beings, each object reflecting quiet continuity and cultural nuance. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, many figurines included hollow interiors or small perforations, likely to ensure stability during firing, or perhaps to provide space for symbolic items or ritual offerings, faint traces of which remain detectable only upon patient inspection. Pigments, derived from subdued minerals, were applied sparingly to accentuate folds, gestures, or delicate accessory details, blending harmoniously with the warm clay tones. Firing in moderate kilns produced tactile surfaces that preserved fingerprints, tool impressions, and subtle irregularities, small marks of the attentive hands that shaped them. Let us drift, ever so softly, over the shaping, smoothing, painting, and firing, imagining artisans moving repetitively and patiently, until each figurine rests in domestic spaces, small shops, or folk art collections, quietly offering calm aesthetic presence, gentle companionship, and enduring continuity across decades. These unassuming objects bridge traditional folk craft with urban consumption, reflecting patient skill and cultural heritage in soft, tactile form. By around 1980 years of our time, in India, clay figurines were produced both for domestic enjoyment and for export, gently linking local artisanship with broader markets while maintaining slow, careful attention to craft. Each figure was kneaded, pressed, and shaped with deliberate, repetitive movements, producing humans, animals, deities, and symbolic motifs that communicated cultural continuity rather than dramatic spectacle. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, hollowing, perforation, or subtle internal cavities were often incorporated, sometimes for kiln stability, sometimes to hold symbolic grains or ritual offerings, leaving delicate traces for the patient observer. Pigments, derived from soft mineral sources, were applied sparingly to robes, hair, and small accessories, harmonizing gently with the warm, earthy tones of the clay. Firing occurred in steady kilns, producing muted, tactile surfaces that preserved fingerprints, tool marks, and slight variations, subtle witnesses to repetitive, attentive shaping. Let us drift, slowly, over the shaping, smoothing, decorating, and firing, imagining hands moving with calm rhythm, producing figures that eventually find homes in domestic shrines, export markets, or festival displays. These figures, entirely modest yet meticulously crafted, offer quiet aesthetic presence, gentle continuity, and cultural preservation, softly bridging centuries of artisan skill with contemporary life, enduring without demand, quietly present in everyday spaces. By around 1990 years of our time, in Europe, clay figurines began to combine traditional forms with contemporary artistic expression, softly bridging historical craftsmanship with new conceptual influences. Artisans kneaded soft clay with careful repetition, shaping humans, animals, abstract forms, and symbolic motifs, attending subtly to proportion, posture, and delicate gestures, creating objects that harmonized quietly with domestic, gallery, or devotional spaces. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, hollowing and subtle perforations continued to be employed, reducing cracking during firing and occasionally allowing for symbolic or decorative insertion, traces of which can still be observed. Pigments, muted and mineral-based, were applied sparingly, accentuating gentle folds, faint facial details, or minor accessory features while remaining entirely in harmony with the natural clay warmth. Firing occurred in moderate kilns, producing tactile surfaces retaining fingerprints, tool impressions, and minor irregularities, small signs of repetitive, attentive shaping. Let us drift softly over the shaping, smoothing, painting, and firing, imagining hands moving in calm rhythm, producing figures that rest quietly in homes, exhibitions, or personal collections, offering gentle aesthetic presence, patient continuity, and enduring witness to attentive craftsmanship, entirely serene, and softly persistent. By around 2000 years of our time, in China, clay figurines were employed in cultural preservation and tourism, softly linking historical craft with the slow rhythms of contemporary engagement. Artisans kneaded pliable clay with quiet, repetitive gestures, shaping humans, animals, and symbolic forms with gentle attention to posture, proportion, and minimal facial expression, producing objects that harmonized with both ritual and commercial display. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, many figurines incorporated hollowing or perforations, sometimes for kiln stability, sometimes to allow symbolic or ritual inclusions, traces of which remain perceptible only to patient observation. Pigments, subdued and mineral-based, were applied with care, highlighting folds of clothing, subtle gestures, or accessory details, blending with the earthy warmth of the clay. Firing occurred in controlled kilns, producing muted tonal surfaces retaining fingerprints, tool marks, and small surface irregularities, quiet witnesses to careful, repetitive shaping. Let us drift ever so softly over the shaping, smoothing, painting, and firing, imagining patient hands moving rhythmically, until figurines rest in museums, cultural centers, or tourist markets, quietly offering calm continuity, cultural reflection, and gentle presence. By around 2010 years of our time, in India, clay figurines gently supported local artisans and traditional crafts, softly bridging centuries of skilled shaping with contemporary domestic and ceremonial needs. Each figure was kneaded, pressed, and shaped in repetitive, careful motions, producing humans, animals, deities, or symbolic forms with subtle posture, proportion, and minimal expression, entirely unassuming in appearance. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, hollowing, perforations, or minute internal cavities were incorporated to stabilize the clay during firing or occasionally to house symbolic grains or ritual objects, traces detectable only to patient observers. Pigments, muted and mineral-based, were applied sparingly to robes, hair, or delicate accessories, harmonizing softly with natural clay hues. Firing in moderate kilns produced warm, tactile surfaces retaining fingerprints, tool marks, and slight imperfections, quiet testimonies to repetitive, attentive shaping. Let us drift gently over the shaping, smoothing, decorating, and firing, imagining the patient rhythm of hands producing figures that find homes in domestic spaces, shrines, or craft markets, quietly preserving cultural gestures, artisan skill, and ceremonial continuity across generations. By around 2020 years of our time, globally, Clay figurines were produced with modern techniques while softly preserving heritage, a gentle melding of contemporary methods with slow, careful traditional practice. Artisans and workshops kneaded clay with calm, repetitive motions, molding humans, animals, and symbolic forms with subtle posture, proportion, and minimal expression, prioritizing attentive shaping over spectacle. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, hollowing, perforation, and delicate internal cavities were sometimes included, providing kiln stability or symbolic space for offerings, traces of which remain faintly visible to patient observers. Pigments, muted and mineral-based, were applied carefully, highlighting folds, gestures, and minor details, harmonizing with the soft earthen tones. Firing occurred in moderate or advanced kilns, producing warm, tactile surfaces retaining fingerprints, tool marks, and slight irregularities, quiet markers of attentive, repetitive shaping. Let us drift softly through shaping, smoothing, painting, and firing, imagining rhythmic hands producing figures that quietly occupy domestic, ritual, or exhibition spaces, preserving cultural continuity while gently embracing modern techniques. By around 2025 years of our time, advanced materials and AI-assisted modeling began to be softly applied to clay figurine design worldwide, merging centuries of traditional practice with computational precision, while maintaining the slow, repetitive, and attentive shaping of human artisans. Clay was kneaded, molded, and refined with care, shaping figures of humans, animals, and symbolic forms, guided subtly by algorithms that assist in proportion, posture, and surface detail, yet leaving space for gentle human oversight. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, hollowing, perforation, or subtle cavities continued to be incorporated, ensuring kiln stability and occasionally allowing room for symbolic or ritual inclusions, faint traces of which endure. Pigments, muted and mineral-based, were applied sparingly to accentuate folds, gestures, and subtle features, harmonizing with warm clay tones. Firing in carefully controlled kilns produced tactile surfaces retaining fingerprints, tool marks, and slight imperfections, soft whispers of human and computational collaboration. Let us drift, ever so softly, through the shaping, smoothing, painting, and firing, imagining rhythmic hands guided by patient attention, producing figures that occupy domestic, ceremonial, or exhibition spaces, quietly preserving tradition while embracing innovation, entirely serene and gently persistent. And now, if your eyes are closed, if your thoughts are drifting, then my job here is done for today. Thank you for spending this unremarkable moment with me. You have listened to The Sleepy Sloth, where uninteresting things become the softest lullabies.